All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. My name is AlexisPells, and I will be presenting to you about my project, Crime in Tucson, Violence and Vulnerability. First of all, I'd like to thank all of my professors for their help throughout the program, and a shout out to my family for their motivation and support during this course. So my project was based in the Tucson, Arizona area, which is obviously an extremely familiar location for the majority of everybody listening in, since most of you live there. In case you aren't as familiar as me, since I don't live there and haven't been, Tucson is the second most populous city in Arizona, just behind Phoenix. They have the largest aircraft boneyard in the world at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and it's also a well-known city for its high crime rates. On the one hand, UNESCO has designated it as the first city in the United States for excellence in gastronomy, but on the other hand, it regularly appears on lists of worst cities to live in due to crime and occasionally the high temperatures. The FBI also provides data about crime all over the country and reported that between 2005 and 2020, violent crime rates in Tucson dropped from 649.7% to 473.5 per 100,000 residents. While this does sound incredible that the crime rate has dropped, it is still much higher than the national crime rate of 366.7 per 100,000 residents. Of the 1.2 million violent crime incidents that took place throughout the United States in 2019, 12,000 of them were in Tucson, so a total of 1%, which is a pretty high rate. The other focus of the project will lead into intelligence-led policing. So the question is, what is that? It is a controversial choice of crime fighting because it relies on organizations to collect data on citizens, such as their demographics, their personal activities, all their information, and they use it to determine crime locations and why crime is occurring in specific locations. The Tucson Police Department began attempts to use this intelligence-led policing in May 2022, and they found much success by doing research on apartments and asking residents their thoughts, and as well as asking them demographics about themselves in order to determine why crime was happening in those areas. So in 2020, a study was conducted in conjunction with the city of Tucson, Pima County, and the Economic and Business Research Center at the University of Arizona by Alicia Kim. And she conducted this study to learn about neighborhood vulnerability index. And she based it on 5 factors, which were the percent of residents identifying as anything other than non-Hispanic, white alone, the percent of households who rent rather than own their homes, the percent of residents aged 25 and over who lack a 4-year bachelor's degree or higher, the percent of households with incomes below 80% of the area median income, and the share of children that live in those households below the official poverty line. She conducted the study at the census tract level and provided a conclusion that 3 or more vulnerable factors meant that a census tract was vulnerable, and used this to separate the census tracts in the Pima County into not vulnerable, vulnerable, more vulnerable, and most vulnerable. Of the 241 census tracts in Pima County, 23 of the most vulnerable ones were found within the city of Tucson limits. And this project will focus on determining whether or not intelligence-led policing is working based on the vulnerability of a neighborhood. The data utilized for this project came mostly from the City of Tucson GIS Open Data database, as well as US Census data, and then added the police incidents from the Tucson Police Department. The boundaries for the City of Tucson are displayed on the reference map shown on the screen and show its location within Arizona, as well as the census tracts throughout the city. Since the Neighborhood Vulnerability Index is based on the census tracts as a neighborhood, the census tracts will be the basis for the analysis throughout the project. So City of Tucson police incidents, you can see on the screen that I have 2019, 2020, and 2021. Each year had approximately 100,000 total police incidents, including violent and nonviolent crimes located all over the city. And the areas that you can see that are red, slightly red, but don't have any incidents include either the airport or Davis-Monthan and some uninhabited areas of Tucson. So 6 major steps were taken to conduct the analysis on the data. I began with basic data handling and spatial joins to ensure that the police incidents being analyzed only included the violent crime that we're researching, and violent crime in Tucson and throughout the United States is identified as aggravated assault, murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, and robbery. Second, we did kernel density, average nearest neighbor, global Moran's 1, geographically weighted regression, and then moved into exploratory regression. So violent crime, as identified by the Tucson Police Department and seen on the screen, includes assault, robbery, homicide, and sexual assault. And there are many more specialized categories within those that were also included as well. And so just to go back, we'll start with number 1, data handling and spatial joins. So using that data handling, there were a lot of police incidents that needed to be cut out due to either incorrect dates that were posted, as well as making sure that they fit the violent police crimes that the Tucson Police Department identified as more violent. And in 2019, it was cut down to 12,193. In 2020, 11,089, and in 2021, 11,691 incidents. Then a spatial join was conducted between the census tracts and the crime count in order to determine how many violent crimes were committed, and just to start having a more clear idea of where these crimes were being committed. And if you look at the legend, you can see that each year has the same number of crime count per tract based on the colors, and then the turquoise color has an extended range just because they may have more or less crimes during that time period. Since the analysis of the crime locations is directly being analyzed in terms of location to vulnerable neighborhoods, a kernel density was conducted for each area. Kernel density is used to calculate the density of specific point features as they occur within a specified area, and it allows for weighting of specific occurrences to mean more or less as necessary. Since the police incidents for this one were already narrowed down to violent crime, each incident was weighted equally and considered just as violent as any other crime within the area. But you can see, as designated in the blue boxes, that the census tracts, which in the blue box are showing as census tracts 1 and 4, had the highest density over them. And then throughout the years, you can see where in 2020, they had several other hotspots increased, and then in 2021 back down to a smaller number. But again, throughout all 3 years, census tracts 1 and 4, which are in the blue box, stayed higher. Average nearest neighbor analysis were conducted on the violent police incidents each year as well to determine the average distance between the incidences and provide a numerical answer to the kernel density visualization. The kernel density does provide numerical data, but it helps to have the graphs in to better understand using other values. It does measure each individual point's nearest neighbor in order to find an average of those distances, and it will help tell us whether or not it's clustered or dispersed. And as you can see on the screen, all 3 years have clustered data and could not be the result of a random chance, since their z-scores are so extremely low. Global Moran's 1 was used next, and it can't be used with individual data points, so the data had to be converted into weighted values. And it was run for each year, and again, as you can see on the screen, all 3 years had clustered data and less than 1% chance that it was a result of a random chance. Again, all of the indices were positive, indicating clustering, which is also demonstrated in the kernel density values. So the null hypothesis of no spatial autocorrelation can be confidently rejected, since the p-value of this one was showing 0 for all 3 years again. Next, a geographically weighted regression was conducted in order to predict the information with a regression equation, which we'll see in a graph on the next slide, that fits every feature in a data set. And it's best used with data sets that have hundreds of points, which fits this analysis, since we're working in the 10,000 plus point incidence. The analysis conducted determined whether or not there was a relationship between the number of crimes and the neighborhood being vulnerable or not. And the results for this showed all 3 years with small r-squared values, indicating a low correlation between vulnerability and violent crime, which is the first analysis that did show that. And all 3 years values were 0.4, which would indicate that it has a low correlation, but in scientific research, it's occasionally accepted that any values that are above 0.4 can be accepted to have a positive correlation. Lastly, exploratory regression was the last tool that was used to determine if any of the individual factors contributing to the neighborhood vulnerability index were indicative of higher violent crime. And in this one, you can see that in generally all 3 years, the vulnerability number, which indicates whether or not a census tract was vulnerable or not, whether or not children who were living below the poverty line and renters and people of color, which is designated as the people who determine themselves to be non-Hispanic, white alone, as well as no college, were the factors that were most important for determining whether or not violent crime was going to be occurring in the area. So as a conclusion, again, we started with the spatial join analysis, which was only used for determining accounts of crime, but began to show hotspots for the area. And then we moved on to kernel density, which again showed hotspots, but proved that the data was clustered and that there's a possibility for the connection of violent crimes within this specific area. And the average nearest neighbor, again, showed clustered violent crimes, but ensured that it was no longer the result of a random chance. Global Moran's 1 was indicative of clustering and not a random chance. So just, again, proving the average nearest neighbor was correct. And then geographically weighted regression showed that all 3 years had small r-squared values, showing the low correlation. But again, r-squared values above 0.4 can sometimes be accepted as statistically significant. And then finally, exploratory regression. And again, talking about the vulnerability, children living below the poverty line, renters, Hispanic residents, and residents who did not have college were the most important factors for this. But some of the limitations of the project were that the actual neighborhoods or specific locations of the crime were not analyzed individually, so it was difficult to say whether or not a specific area within a census tract was more or less vulnerable to crime, even though the demographics of the area might indicate otherwise. And it would be helpful for the Tucson Police Department to be able to target specific streets or buildings rather than just census tracts as a whole, since they don't necessarily have the people or the ability to spread out throughout the census tract as a whole. In addition, as you can see with the low p-values and the low z-values, that there were too many options for displaying hotspots and the locations of the crime incidents, and using more specific violent crime analysis between the different types of violent crime might have been a better, a smaller data set for future information. Next steps for the data set would be to have more data and be able to indicate other demographics and other factors that could provide more insight and narrow down what truly allows for violent crime to become prevalent in specific areas, including access to weapons, proximity to stores that sell guns, or the ease of acquiring permits, as well as many others. And that concludes my presentation.